Hi, my name is Brenda Herchmer. Welcome to Why Community Building, Why Now? Part 3. And this is about making the case and in terms of why community building and community-led development is so critical. So in part 2, we talked about 3 different approaches to organizing and building community. And in part 3, we're really going to dive a little bit deeper into social planning and community development, which really are the 2 predominant models for building community in the organizations and the governments where most of us are working these days. This slide is probably one of the most important in that it does explain the differences between the 2 predominant approaches, one being social planning and the second one being community development. And a lot of these learnings came from the ABCD Institute with John McKnight. ABCD stands for Asset-Based Community Development. And they explained the appropriateness of community development using these kinds of statements. And I'm hoping that you can see that community development is in the green and social planning, which is probably most predominant these days still, is in the blue. So while there is time and a place for social planning, the blue, you hopefully will be able to see why community development is of such critical importance. And often this is referred to as a push and pull model in the sense that, when we're approaching things from a social planning perspective, it's really about the needs, and it's really looking at the glass of water as being half empty with things that we need to add to make them full. And that's different from community development, which is more of an asset-based approach. And so, the social planning is more of a push model because we're pushing at people, and assets is really more of a pull model where we're pulling in their assets and their gifts. And so social planning is really focused on how do we meet the needs of our consumers, what products, what programs, what events do they need. And we typically have been seen, at least I know that the way that I was trained is that I was an expert. I was educated. It was my job to sort out what programs were needed. So, we were seen as experts. The challenge is that does create a dependency cycle. And to me, it's not unlike being parents and having, and using an approach that makes your children dependent on you. And that's different from a community development approach, because there you're really looking at each citizen as an asset, and you look at your role as being that of connecting the various contributions and gifts of our citizens. And they are citizens who get things done, and that's one of the things that I don't know that people always understand, is that they're not aligned necessarily with any one organization or business or government, and so they don't often get bogged down in red tape the way people who work for one organization do and need to stick to their mandate. Citizens, in my experience, for the most part, just get things done. There isn't that same amount of red tape. But part of it is that we have to see them as the answer. And that's what's going to increase their potential and our potential for innovation and sustainability. This chart is something that I did a while back to really illustrate the different social planning approaches, how they relate to power, and how they collectively are determinants of community growth. So if you look at the horizontal axis on the bottom, it's really looking at social planning as relying on professional social action as rallying to claim control, and community development as being citizen-led planning. And on the vertical axis, I related it back to power because so much of this is about power and who holds it. So if we have a social planning approach and it shows limited involvement of citizens, then we're likely only going to be able to maintain the status quo, not necessarily get to transformative growth and innovation. If we have a social action approach it does certainly involve citizens. They really are empowered. And it will get us a lot of times to change that reforms. And if you talk to futurists, they often talk about two different kinds of change. Change that reforms and change that transforms. And if we're going to deal with a lot of the complex issues in our communities and our world today, we really need to go beyond reforming change, because that just really makes things more efficient and effective. We've got to get to transformative change. And that the only way we're going to get there is really citizen-led community development, because that's where citizens are empowered. That's how we get to transformative change and innovation. And it's not just citizens who are involved. I mean, our job here in community development is to make the focus about getting all three sectors in the room, because we need the collective. We need the best of business, government, and not-for-profits in order to get to transformative change with citizens. In your work as a future-focused leader and as a community builder, you're going to be called upon or challenged in terms of using a community development approach. And the reality is that in large part that is because many who are holding power may be reluctant to give over that power to others in terms of decision making. So these are the advantages that you can bring to that discussion or to that justification in terms of the advantages brought by community development. And so these are all listed here on this slide and the next one as well. And really, I'm not going to read them. My guess is that you're aware of a lot of them already, but this is really intended as a resource for you. So advantages of community development here, as well as on this slide. And yes, of course, there are disadvantages of community development, and we would be remiss if we don't talk about those a little bit. The first is that community development is difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to quantify for political success. I mean, how do you measure the value of keeping youth out of trouble? But it is really, it is possible, and we're going to talk about that in one of our other modules. I think staff and volunteers who are attracted by the concept of community development and helping others might also have a tendency to take on too much because they really want to help. The result can be encroachment on our personal lives and eventual burnout. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And sometimes it's just a case of taking care of each other. And I know I actually had a director at one point who sent me home because I don't know if I would have gone home on my own, but he recognized the signs of burnout and insisted that I take loo time off. And the last one really is that community development, the argument for many is that it will likely take more time. But I think in reality what I see is that it takes more time up front. So it seems like it's going to take longer, but in the long run it does not, because there's consensus. At the beginning, there's excitement, there's enthusiasm, and things start to happen because people take responsibility. And so that's really worth, and that's that's different from social planning, where it might seem easier to make the decisions ourselves and put it into place, but we're not necessarily going to get better decisions, and we're certainly not going to get ownership from others in terms of putting it into place. So might not really be a disadvantage. So what we're trying to do ultimately is really create a sense of community, and a lot of this is really just buying into the fact that every individual has a gift to contribute, and our job is to provide opportunities and support for those gifts to be shared. And I love one of these expressions that comes from John McKnight's group, which is, our job is to welcome the stranger and new and innovative ideas. So it's really about creating a sense of place, supporting opportunities that nurture and celebrate community spirit, and reflecting values that prioritize quality of life and happiness, because too often our focus has been on the economy as opposed to quality of life. Cormac Russell, this lovely Irish scholar, has this amazing command of language, and he describes community development as moving from what's wrong to what's strong, which I just think is a great way of describing community development. He also says that people often measure a community's strength by its resiliency. He said, I think we should measure a community's strength by their capacity to welcome people from the edge to the center, because we need their gifts. And what a great philosophy for us to embrace. So why community building? Well, there is this imbalance in the world. We're seeing it as an imbalance. I was always referring to it as an imbalance between economic development and quality of life. And really that's what I was seeing as impacting, putting a priority on personal, social, environmental, and economic well-being. But we're seeing it surfacing significantly post-pandemic. I wish it was post-pandemic, but the pandemic really seemed to surface this discussion. And Mark Carney, you used to be the Governor General of the Bank of Canada, and then went to that same position in Great Britain. He's written a book that explains it a little bit differently. He really talks about how market values have become predominant. And they've become our world values, that they've simply taken over, that money is ruling, in other words. And he told the story that I loved about Pope Francis, and he said that, when we look at market values versus human values, he said human values are many things. He said market values are about one thing, self-interest. And I thought, what a great way to explain why we need to advocate and be an ambassador for ensuring more emphasis is placed on human values. If we don't, this is what happens. And we're seeing this. We are so seeing this right now. When that power is imbalanced, there's all kinds of issues that we're dealing with. We're dealing with that fallout right now in terms of healthcare, reduced social capacity, a lack of care for the environment, this huge divide between those who have and those who do not. So it's really essential that we try to really work at increasing balance, and community development is definitely the way to go. It really is a process for thinking big but starting small. And we've talked in the first overview about future-focused community leaders needing to think about systems thinking, meaning putting the broader lens beyond our own organization, really thinking about our broader community, our regions, our province, and even our country, and globally. So it's kind of a case of thinking, being a localist with a global lens. Community-led development is a big part of that, and that's what we've been talking about right now, but also strategic foresight. And when we put those together, we're going to use them in this process that is really about thinking big but starting small. And as you can see, at the very core of this is community leadership. So that's where we begin, because if we start there with a cohort of leaders who drive the change, we can do it for a short-term project to start that builds trust, builds hope, builds relationships, and then tackle the longer-term quality of life, big picture issues. And we're also going to introduce you to a planning approach that is grounded in community development, and that's in an upcoming module. The other thing, as we do all of this, it's really important to think about the change in values, because that's a part of why community building and community development is going to be more important. Our basic beliefs, our values, our attitudes, our behaviors are really products of our times, and really of where we're located in the world. And so it's, a lot of those values are rooted in religions and work ethics and the economy and our culture. But even today we're shifting, and so we're really shifting from independence to interdependence, from a focus on consumerism to quality of life, local to global, and anthropocentrism to environmental stewardship. And really what that means is that we often have thought that humans were superior and we ruled, and we're learning that, yeah, we got to take care of the environment too. And it's also about being less judgmental and really valuing being perceptive. And so, we're living right now with leaders who learned their values in a different time and in a different era. And so that's important to really try to suspend judgment and really understand why things are different right now. But be aware of those shifts in values, because not everyone is in the same place. That's the point. So the enlightened leader is going to be those of you who can encourage the shifts to the right-hand column. And my guess is that you're doing that already. And probably it's you're fighting against the current. Sometimes I get that, and that's hard, and it's really lonely a lot of times. But the promise is not on the left-hand column. It's really on the right, and it's a philosophy that is going to require using community development. And here's another summary. And again, this is a resource for you. A lot of this is not going to be new to you, but it's been well curated, and it's the result of what we've learned from other leaders working across the country. So this is really thinking about what's going on in the world and why all of this is calling for a different approach, which is really community-led development. So what does that mean for you? For you as a community builder, as a future focused leader, it means that we need to be okay with letting go of a need for order and structure. And we've all got to get better at living with the reality of chaos as communities find new ways of working together. That will be harder for some of us than others. And that's just important to understand. That's one of the reasons for the leadership tools that we used in the last module. So we need to, it means we need to work with people who we need to encourage to let go of fears and control and place more trust in citizens and communities. And we also need to really ensure we're working with leadership teams, because teams will drive change, growth, and positive impact. And that's, we'll do that, and we'll unpack that more in upcoming modules in terms of how we get more buy-in. I guess this is what we're ultimately saying here, is that we're not going to be able to plan in the same way. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be linear. It's just not going to be as orderly as we might like it to be. But I think if we keep in mind that the wisdom of the community always exceeds the knowledge of the experts. And it's not to say we don't need experts, but experts need to provide the information to help us collectively make informed decisions. And how do we do that? Well, you've experienced this assessment in terms of the competencies that are required for future focused leaders, and that's what you're going to see threaded throughout this course. We're going to dive deeper, and these will be threaded throughout, that will ensure you have the competencies needed to rethink locally and act globally for a better world.